Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Understanding Robots to Improve SEO Performance. Thank you again for taking the time to join us this morning. We're so glad that you are here, and it's great to see so many familiar names, as well as a few new ones. I want to start by introducing who we are. I am Andrea, a partner and consultant here at Elementive, and obviously here with me today is the man of the hour, Matthew. And we are your Elementive team. Matthew and I started Elementive over 8 years ago, really with the primary goal of helping businesses improve the performance of their websites. And we really hold true to that still today by offering ongoing consultation, website reviews, performance audits, as well as many other services. If you are interested in learning more about who we are and what we do, we invite you to visit our website, elementive.com. Before I let Matthew take over and jump into the webinar, I want to let you know that we have saved time at the end to answer questions you may have. So please feel free to post those in the chat, which you can find hopefully in the lower right corner of your desktop screen. As well, we are recording the webinar and we will be sure to send it out to everybody who registered later this week. So look for that in your inbox. With all of that, I will be sure to pass it over to Matthew and kind of respond to some of the messages coming in now. And thank you very much again for being here today. We're so thankful you joined us. Matthew, take it away.
Thanks, Andrea, and hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's great to see so many of you here to talk about technical SEO. When I start talking about technical SEO with people, one of the most common things I hear, one of the most common responses I get is that it seems complicated. And it seems like there's a lot of things going on with technical SEO. There's a lot of concepts, there's a lot of terminology, there's a lot of things to keep track of. And it's true, there's some complexity within technical SEO, but we can simplify things by bringing it back to fundamentals. And that's what I want to talk about today, is the fundamentals of technical SEO. And those fundamentals really come down to this question that's up on the screen of what do search robots do? Because the more we can understand what search robots are doing, how search robots are behaving, what search robots are attempting to accomplish, the easier it is to understand all those other concepts and ideas and things going on with technical SEO. So we really want to dive in and understand search robots a little bit better and understand their behaviors a little bit better. And search robots have three primary behaviors. The first of those behaviors is crawling. When it comes to crawling, search robots need to go through the entire web and they need to find everything they possibly can find. And then once they find everything, they need to fetch all the content from those files and bring it back in for further processing. That step of further processing is called indexing. And during indexing, robots are trying to make sense of everything that they've found on the web. So they're going through everything. They're trying to categorize stuff. They're trying to figure out what topics those pages are talking about and how those pages relate to other pages that have been found. And then once the robots build this index or this big database of all the content that exists that they found, then they have to rank. And that's that third behavior the robots go through, is ranking all the stuff in the index in response to search queries. So this is the part of search that we see, right? When we go to Google, we conduct a search, we see the search results come back. Well, robots have to figure out what results to return, what results to surface, what actually should be displayed from the index. So crawling, indexing, and ranking are the three main behaviors robots go through. And everything in technical SEO comes back to one of those three behaviors. So every concept, every idea, every term you've ever heard related to technical SEO relates to crawling, indexing, or ranking. And we need to understand these behaviors more clearly and understand what robots are trying to do at each of these stages. So that way we know how to really optimize and improve our websites for SEO performance. So let's talk about these in more detail, starting with crawling. So, right, crawling is all about robots going out on the web, trying to find all the files that exist and then fetching the content from those files. So when crawling, robots are greedy. They're programmed to look for everything. They want to find every file type they possibly can. That includes HTML files, just normal web pages. That includes PDFs, images, videos, doc files, Excel files, any kind of file you have on your website. Robots want to find it, and they're programmed to find everything they possibly can. Now, normally that works in our favor, right? We want robots to find all the files that exist on our website. But there are some kinds of files we don't want robots to find. So, for example, think about login areas on a website or dev areas or staging areas, right? We don't want robots to find those. If robots find those, that's actually a bit of a problem for us, and it can actually be somewhat counterproductive for our SEO performance. So we need to take proactive steps to prevent robots from finding those things. So we're actively working against robots in those cases. So if you have a staging environment out there, you need to take a lot of steps to make sure robots can't find it. Because if robots find some way in, they're going to crawl it because that's what robots are trying to do. Now, also when crawling, robots are constantly on the lookout for anything that's changing. So that's anything that's new that's added to the website or anything that's updated on the website. And here again, that usually works in our favor, right? Because we want robots to find the new stuff we're adding to our website. We want robots to find the stuff we're updating on our website. But occasionally there are things that robots do here that are kind of weird and seem counterproductive for us. Robots will return to every URL they know about. That includes old URLs that maybe haven't existed on your website for years. That includes error URLs, right? URLs that have returned errors for years on end. Robots are still crawling them. This is also true for redirects. URLs that have redirected for years and years still get crawled by Google. And that seems kind of weird when you first think about it, right? Why is Google doing this? Aren't they smart enough to stop crawling something that redirects? Aren't they smart enough to stop crawling something that returns an error? But when you think about what robots are programmed to do, what they're trying to accomplish here, they're trying to keep an update on everything they've ever known about. And that means robots have to come back to every URL they've ever found, because robots know that a URL that returned an error yesterday may not return that error tomorrow. URLs that redirected yesterday may not redirect tomorrow, or they might redirect somewhere else. So robots need to constantly be checking on these things. And that means that to really support robots and help robots understand our website, we need to be very consistent in the signals we're sending. So if a URL is supposed to return an error, it needs to return an error from now and on indefinitely. Same with redirects. If something needs to redirect, we need redirects to be seen by robots, we need robots to understand that we have changed a URL, then we need those redirects to exist indefinitely. Now, there's some other things that we can do to help robots crawl our websites more effectively, make things a little bit easier for robots and what they're trying to do. One of the most important things we can do, one of the most fundamental things really that we can do is use clean URL structures. And we can make it really clear to robots which URLs we prefer they use. That's called the canonical URL. And we want to enforce that and really make it unambiguous for robots what we want them to be crawling on our website. We can also send really clear signals to robots using status codes. And we can also make sure that we're rendering content in a way that's really easy for robots to work with and be able to find and fetch our content correctly. So let's go through these a little bit more. Starting with URL structure. So there's a lot of pieces and parts to a URL, right? There's protocols and the domain and the host name and the path and the query string. There's a lot of different pieces and parts to the URL. And to robots, each of these parts matters a great deal. And if any one part of the URL changes, a robot is going to say, well, that's an entirely different URL. And that's because a URL is used to identify a page. So if robots find a different URL, they're going to assume that's a different identifier for a different page. So we want to make sure that we're being really clean in our URL structure and we're not giving any conflicting signals to robots. Some of the most common problems we see around this is that there are some pages on a website that do not redirect over to HTTPS. They return at both HTTP and HTTPS pages. So a robot's going to see that, and they're going to say, well, this is two different pages. There's a page at HTTP, there's a page at HTTPS. And you and I are going to look at that and go, come on, it's the same page, same design, same content, same everything. Why isn't a robot smart enough to get that? And later on, robots might be able to figure that out. Later on, robots might be able to go through during the indexing stage and reconcile some of those discrepancies and figure out which one to use. But they may not make the right decision at that point. They sometimes might decide to rank neither of those pages. They might decide to include both of those pages, or they might choose one over the other, and that may not be the one that we want them to choose. We've seen a lot of cases where this happens, and robots choose to rank the HTTP page instead of the HTTPS page. So it creates that confusion for robots because we're returning things at two different URLs. We can simplify all of this for robots by picking the preferred URL, in this case, by redirecting everything over to HTTPS and not giving any opportunities for robots to find multiple types of URLs. The exact same thing is true with www and non-www in the URL. Doesn't matter which one you use, websites with and without www can rank perfectly fine, but you want to make sure to not use both. So you want to make sure that if your website uses www, then you do not let any pages return at non-www. Because if you do, then that can create confusion for robots that they have to go back through and reconcile and hopefully figure something out, and hopefully figure out something that aligns with what we want them to figure out. But that's not always going to be the case. So we want to reduce that confusion for robots by helping them understand which URL we prefer. Another example of this that happens a lot is parameters in the URL. So parameters are that part of the URL after the question mark. Sometimes that's also called the query string. And the parameters in the URL can create a lot of confusion for robots here, because robots will see a parameter and they'll say, well, that parameter is one URL. But if the values in that parameter change just slightly, then robots are going to think that's an entirely different URL. So let's say you have question mark, color equals blue, and size equals large in your query string. That's one URL. But you reverse those parameters and you say size equals large and color equals blue, going the other direction. That's a different URL. So now robots see two different URLs on the site, and that creates more work for robots to have to go through and figure things out. We don't want them to have to do that much work to crawl our websites. So we can reduce that work for robots, reduce that confusion by using really consistent, clean URLs and making sure we really are clear to robots what URL they ought to be crawling. We can also send really clear signals to robots with status codes. So a status code is a numerical value sent back by the server that indicates something about the status or the nature of that page. So if a page is operating just fine, it's working as it should, the server is going to send back a status code of 200. And that means it's okay. The page is operating in okay parameters. It's doing what it's supposed to do. Redirects return a status code of 301 or 302. Not found error returns a status code of 404, and so on, right? There's lots of different status codes, and we want to be very intentional about which status codes we're sending, because robots, when they're crawling, are going to use those status codes to understand how they need to be crawling that page. And there are some problems that can come up here if you send incorrect status codes. The most common problem is a soft 404. So a soft 404 means that the status code being returned by the server is a status 200. Everything is perfectly okay, is what the server is telling the robot. And the robot looks at the page content and says, no, it's not. The page itself says this page cannot be found. This page is an error. So we've got the status code on one hand that's saying one thing, and we have the page text on the other hand that's saying something else. And robots are going to have to process this and figure this out. And here again, usually they'll make the right call, they'll understand what's going on and be able to figure out how to handle this. They don't always make the right call. And even if they eventually make the right call, it slows down their crawling, makes things harder for a robot to work with our websites. We don't want robots to work hard when they're crawling our websites. We want to make it real easy for them to understand when things are in error. Another example of this are server errors. Server errors are supposed to return a status code that starts with the number 5. They're in the 5xx class of status codes. But sometimes server errors return a status 200 and say everything is okay, even though the page itself says something went wrong on the server. Other times we've seen server errors return a 404. A 404 is a very different kind of error than a server error, and robots are going to handle that kind of error in a completely different way. So here again, we want to return the appropriate status code for the server error. And there's lots of different kinds of server errors. There's lots of different kinds of status codes for that. So you want to be very picky about which status code is getting returned, so that way robots really know how to work with your website correctly. Another area where we see status code problems for robots is with redirects. Redirects can either return a status code that says it's a permanent redirect, a 301, or they can return a status code that says it's a temporary redirect, a 302. And if you use the wrong status code, robots are going to handle that in different ways. Now, you will hear Google come out and they will say things where eventually they might start treating a 302 as a 301. But there again, they're having to do more work. They're having to process things more. They're having to figure more things out on our behalf. And they may not always make the right call. Maybe we do really want that to be treated as a 302. So we need to be very intentional in how we're using status codes on our website and within our redirects, so that way robots know how to handle it correctly. Another part of crawling isn't just robots trying to find everything and understand what they found, but it's also robots trying to fetch the content from those files, actually pull content out of those files. And we can make things easier for robots here as well by rendering things appropriately. Rendering just means, how does the code get presented on the browser, or how does the code get presented for the robot? And there's two different kinds of rendering. And the difference is really in who's doing the work, in putting all the code together. And there's server-side rendering, where the server is doing all of the work, putting everything together. And there's client-side rendering, where the server is doing some of the work, but the client, or the browser is known as a client, is doing some of the work to put all the stuff together to display on the page. So with server-side rendering, the server sends back the code all put together, and all the robot or the browser has to do is just output it and display it. With client-side rendering, though, the robot or the browser has to go through and they have to execute additional code. This is JavaScript code that they have to go through, and they have to do more work executing that JavaScript code, actually trying to put those functions in the JavaScript code to use to output some of the content on the page. Now, robots can execute some JavaScript, so it's fine if you're using some level of client-side rendering, but you want to make sure you use client-side rendering in a way that robots can work with. And there's some problems that can come up here with client-side rendering. One of the biggest problems is that the JavaScript file simply takes too long to load. Robots will wait for the JavaScript file to load, and they will wait, and they will wait, but there is only so long that robots will wait before they have to move on, and they have to worry about some other website or some other page, and they have to work on that. So you need to make sure that your JavaScript file is able to load quickly, that it will run quickly, so that way robots are able to get through that as effortlessly as possible. Now, another problem that we see come up with client-side rendering is that sometimes the content is loaded in a way that bots can't actually use the code. So everything in JavaScript is based around events. So JavaScript is triggered by different events that happen in the browser. And robots only work with one of those events. They only work with an onload event, which is the event that fires when the page actually loads. So robots can execute any and all code that they find that happens on load. But if those content scripts and those things loaded from JavaScript only load in response to other events, robots aren't going to be able to do that. So if you have to click a button before you see content come in, if you have to scroll down the page before you see content come in, robots aren't going to do that, and they aren't going to see the content. And if robots can't see the content, and the content is just some supplementary stuff, it's maybe some ads that come in, or it's some third-party widgets or tools that you're adding into the page, it's probably okay if robots don't see it. But this is a big problem if the content that robots are unable to load is really core or key content that you need robots to see to really understand your page and be able to work with and rank your page correctly. So you need to go through and make sure that your JavaScript code is loading in a way that robots can actually work with it and can actually execute it, and that it's happening on load. Another problem we see come up a lot with JavaScript is that JavaScript files get blocked from robots. Sometimes this is intentionally happening. For example, on the robots.txt file, there might be a disallow that disallows any JavaScript from getting crawled. Then you can just remove that. That's a pretty simple one to fix. But other times, JavaScript files get blocked from robots because of some kind of setting on the server. There's some kind of rate limiting or some kind of restriction that's put on robots, and they're simply not allowed to access that file. And here again, if they can't access that file and that JavaScript file is responsible for loading the main content of the page, that's a big problem. And you're going to struggle to get Google to rank the page correctly. So you want to make sure that Google and other robots are able to crawl and execute all of your JavaScript code successfully, particularly if you're relying on that JavaScript code for the main content of your page. So by the time robots are done crawling, they've found everything on websites, they've fetched all the content from those pages. Now they have to make sense of that. And that process of making sense of things is called indexing. So when robots are indexing, the first thing they're going to do is they're going to try and extract meaning from the page. They're going to try and figure out what the page is about. So they're going through the page and saying, well, what does this page talk about? Does it talk about people? Does it talk about certain topics? Does it talk about certain companies? What is this page really referring to? And how does this page then relate to all the other pages that robots know about? They're trying to categorize this, trying to organize all this information in a more systematic way. Along with that, robots, when indexing, are also evaluating all the content they've found to figure out how quality this is. What does this content really look like? So if you've heard about EEAT factors, experience, expertise, authoritativeness, and trustworthiness, that's happening here. Robots are evaluating that content and saying, is it written at a level that it needs to be written at given the nature of the topic? And some topics are going to be held to much higher standards than other topics. If you have a website in a medical space, robots are going to evaluate that and look at those EEAT factors a lot more than they will for other kinds of topics. So you need to make sure that your content isn't just written at a high quality level. You need to make sure that your content is written at a high quality level within your particular industry, within the particular topic and category robots are going to associate your website with. So we want to make indexing as easy as possible for robots. Obviously, some of that begins with crawling and making sure that robots were able to find everything correctly on our website and understand everything correctly on our website. But we can also make indexing easier by improving our content and site quality and also improving our website's technical structure. Some of that definitely gets into things that aren't technical, right? That's editorial decisions about how the content is written and how the content is put together and the information architecture of the website. But there are definitely some technical things we need to do to help improve the content and site quality. And one of the biggest things to keep in mind from a technical standpoint with content quality is that Google classifies content in different ways. So they go through a page of content and they start breaking the content on that page into different buckets. And one of those buckets that Google's going to put stuff in is main content. Main content is the part of the page that, in Google's words, helps the page achieve its purpose. Basically, it's the stuff the page is really about. You take everything else away from the page, all you have left is the main content. You can still get what you need from the page. Supplementary content is everything else on the page. That's the navigation, that's the sidebar, that's the header, the footer, calls to action, right? All that other stuff that's on the page that doesn't really help the page achieve its main purpose. It's just kind of extra stuff that helps enhance the design and the user experience of the page. So right away, technically, one of the first things we need to do is make sure that Google will be able to correctly distinguish supplementary content from main content. That gets to how the page is designed, but also gets to how the HTML code is written on the page. Is it written as cleanly as possible to make it easy for robots to break this apart into main content and supplementary content? The more that robots have to work to break this apart, the more they struggle to break this apart, the more they're not going to be able to index the content on the page correctly. So you want to make sure that your HTML and your design are really put together in a way where it's really clear to robots what's main content, what's the core stuff on the page that you really want them to find, and what's the supplementary content, that's the extra stuff on the page. So you want to really make sure that you're doing that from a technical standpoint. And as we think about main content and supplementary content, that also starts to influence how we can think about content quality. Because Google doesn't care about the content quality really of the page itself, they care about the content quality of the main content on the page. So as we think about some of the common content quality problems that can come up, like duplication, thinking about main content changes how we think about this problem. So when it comes to duplication, robots don't care if the supplementary content is duplicated across pages. In fact, they probably expect it to be duplicated across pages, right? Your navigation, your sidebar, calls to action, those kind of things, those are going to be the same across multiple pages, and that's just fine. But you don't want your main content to be the same across multiple pages. And keep in mind too, with duplication, it's not just that the page is exactly the same, written in exactly the same words, using exactly the same phrasing. It's duplication of purpose. It's duplication of meaning, right? Think about what robots have been doing through this indexing phase. They've been trying to understand what the page is about. And so robots are going to look at a page and say, well, page A is about these topics over here. It's talking about these things, but page P happens to be talking about exactly the same things. And so if those two pages are talking about exactly the same things, even if they're using different words, they're going to consider that duplication. And robots are going to do work at the indexing level to try and figure out how they resolve that duplication. Obviously, we can avoid running into that problem and avoid robots having to do that work by finding that level of duplication on our website. But that's duplication within the main content, and that's duplication at not just a word level, but a meaning level and a purpose level of the page. Another content quality problem we see come up a lot is thin content. Thin doesn't mean the length of the page, right? Thin means, is this content not sufficient enough to address the topic being covered? This is also related to this recent idea that Google has introduced starting at the end of last year with helpful content, rolled out a couple helpful content updates now, where they're evaluating how helpful or how useful the content is. Here again, this is the main content of the page we're talking about. And they're looking at, is that main content of the page helpful enough given what the page is talking about? You can have a perfectly helpful page, perfectly high quality page that's very short. You can also have a perfectly unhelpful page and a thin page that's very long. So as you evaluate your website's main content and you look at how the main content is put together, you want to decide, given the nature of this page, given what this page is talking about, is there enough content here to adequately address the topic? Another content quality problem that comes up a lot is orphan links. So an orphan link is any page on the website that doesn't have any internal links pointing to it. So that page is orphaned. It's cut off from the rest of the site hierarchy. So when we're talking about orphans, usually just when you look at crawl tools or something like that, they will say you have these orphan pages, and they're referring to pages that have no internal links from anywhere on the website. But we can think a little bit more nuanced about this, right? Because now that we understand robots are breaking things down with main content versus supplementary content, what do robots really care about? They care about main content, right? So they're caring about internal links contained in that main content. So when robots are evaluating orphaned pages and they're looking for those pages that don't have internal links, what robots are really trying to figure out is pages that don't have internal links from anywhere else in page's main content. So they don't care so much if there's internal links within supplementary content because robots know that's real easy to put links in supplementary content. I can throw as many links as I want. In my sidebar, I can throw as many links as I want in my header, but it's much harder to put internal links within main content. So as you go through and you start evaluating your internal links and you start looking at your pages and you start identifying orphaned pages, you want to make sure that you not just are resolving orphans overall, but you're resolving orphans that don't have internal links within the site's main content. Internal links also get us to thinking about the technical structure of the site. So internal links are the way that robots understand everything that exists on the website and how everything is related to each other on the main website. So some of the problems that come up here with internal links is that internal links can point to things like errors. And it's okay if a few internal links point to errors. But if a lot of internal links point to errors, then robots are going to get confused about the nature of this website. They're going to say, well, everything on this website seems to lead to an error message. And that seems like a low quality website. The same thing is true for redirects. A few redirects and internal links, that's okay. But if you have a lot of internal links that are pointing to redirects, robots have to do a lot more work to understand the site quality. So they might see that one page redirects to another page, and they'll understand that links to that page that redirects should really be resolved to that other page instead. And usually robots are pretty good at figuring that out. But if you have a lot of redirects for robots to do that with and process, And that's a lot more work that robots have to do. And somewhere along the way, they're probably going to make a mistake and not correctly understand your site's structure. The other thing to keep in mind when we're talking about technical structure is the XML sitemap. The XML sitemap is a list of all the different pages that exist on your website. So essentially, the XML sitemap is a whole bunch of internal links. And you want to make sure that the XML sitemap shows correct URLs to robots, that it doesn't contain errors, that it doesn't contain redirects, because just like any other internal link, an XML sitemap is going to slow robots down if it's full of errors, if it's full of redirects for them to process. So by the time we've gotten through indexing, robots have gone through, they've processed everything, they've made sense of stuff, they have an idea of what pages are about. Now they are ready to return that information to people in rankings. So ranking is where robots are going through and figuring out what information from that index they should return to the end user who is conducting a search. And robots at this level too are trying to figure out how that information should be displayed. Should that information be displayed in traditional search results? Should that information be featured in a featured snippet? Or should it be pulled into a people also ask, or maybe a carousel or the knowledge panel, right? All the different features that exist on search results. This is the level at which robots are figuring that out. What information do they put into those different features that exist? And of course, when ranking, robots are also trying to figure out what order things show up in, right? What ranking things show up in. Where do they place stuff on the page? We want to do our best to make ranking decisions easier for robots. And clearly, some of the stuff that we've talked about with crawling and indexing relate to this. We are not going to be making things easy for robots to rank if it's really hard for them to crawl our website or if it's really hard for them to index our website. But assuming we've done everything right with crawling and we've done everything right with indexing, then there's a few specific things we can do to make things easier for robots when it comes to ranking. One of the biggest things we can do is we can follow Google's page experience guidelines. We can also use proper HTML structure, and we can also use schema markup where it's appropriate. So going through those, starting with page experience, there's a couple things that are really relevant to page experience here. The first of those is Core Web Vitals. So Core Web Vitals is Google's way of looking at site speed. Now, it's really important to keep in mind here that we're talking about Core Web Vitals at a ranking level. Core Web Vitals is only applied by Google at a ranking level. They are not bringing Core Web Vitals into play when it comes to speed, when it comes to indexing or when it comes to crawling, right? Speed doesn't really factor into those, at least not at the Core Web Vitals level. Core Web Vitals is really used at the ranking level to understand how good is this page? Is this page delivering a good experience or not? Because robots want to rank pages that deliver a good experience just a little bit higher in search results. And that's how Google really talks about this. They say that Core Web Vitals is a ranking boost. And in particular, it's a ranking boost in really competitive search results. So if they have two pages that everything else is pretty much neck and neck on those pages, everything else is really good on those two pages, the content is good, the site quality is good, it's authoritative, right? Everything is matching, but they need a tiebreaker between the two. That tiebreaker is going to be Core Web Vitals, and they're looking at these three metrics. Now, the other thing to keep in mind with Core Web Vitals is that this is not how quickly a robot was able to load the page. Core Web Vitals is looking at how quickly actual people were able to load the page. So what Google is measuring here is the average of these three metrics over the last 4 weeks for people who have visited this website in Google Chrome. And so they're measuring these metrics and then evaluating the website based on that rolling average for how people have actually interacted with the page. And this makes sense, right? Because robots know that you can make things load really fast for Google, right? I can change things around, I can make things load super fast for a robot, but I can't do that as easily for actual people. Plus, robots know that people come to the website with all different kinds of connection speeds. Some have really slow speeds, some have really fast speeds. So they want to take that average across all of those. So as you're working on improving Core Web Vitals for your website, make sure you keep in mind that there are real people being measured here. So measure your website across a variety of connection speeds, measure your website across a variety of devices to really see what real people will encounter on your website. The other page experience factor to keep in mind is mobile friendliness. So mobile friendliness is an older thing that Google's worked on going back to really 2014, 2015. The mobile friendliness is a way of evaluating how good this page looks on mobile devices. So does the content fit on the device? Does the text seem like it can be read on the mobile device, or is it a bit too small on that device? Can elements be clicked on? Can you click on links? Can you click on buttons easily on there? If you can't do those things, then it doesn't present as good an experience. And just like Core Vitals, this is not something Google is taking into account at the indexing level. This is something Google is taking into account at the ranking level. This is something that Google is going to bring in at the very end of the process and say, oh, okay, this page delivers a good experience. So that might mean that that page will rank just a little bit easier in search results. So we want to make sure that we're meeting these page experience guidelines so that way Google is able to give our website a little bit of a boost in really competitive search results. Another thing we can do to help Google rank our site a little bit better is use proper HTML structure. So when Google is figuring out, okay, how do we display things in this ranking, they want to pull in some information from the page, things like title tags and meta description tags. We want to bring those in. So we want to make sure it's real easy for robots to find that stuff on our website. So we want to make sure that things are coded correctly with our title tag, with our meta description tag. Another example of this would be header tags, H1s, H2s, H3s, right? The headers and subheaders within our content. If we code those correctly, Google might grab some of those headers and might display those within a featured snippet. So we want to make sure that we're coding things properly so that way Google can correctly grab that content and show it in rankings. Same is true of jump links. If you've ever seen little links underneath a search result, and those links take you somewhere else on that same page, those are jump links that have been coded into the page. So we want to make sure we're coding those into our page correctly. So that way robots can, if they want to, grab that stuff from our page. Another way that we can enhance search results is by using schema, sometimes called structured data markup. So schema, or structured data, is extra code you put on the page that marks up the page and describes more about what that content is. So this content is about a person, or this content contains a review, or this is an FAQ, right? Those kinds of things you can do with schema. And so robots will go through and they'll see that you've used schema on your site, and then they might choose to use that schema to enhance search results. It's important to know that they don't always use schema. And if you think about it from a robot's perspective, that makes sense, because what a robot is trying to do at the ranking level is they are trying to say, well, okay, what's the best possible way I can show this search result? What's the best possible way I can return this, given everything that robot knows about the person conducting the search and the search being conducted? And sometimes robots are going to say, yeah, schema fits perfectly, and I want to include that here, given everything the robot knows. Other times they're going to say, nope, schema doesn't fit here. So just because you use schema doesn't mean it's going to show up consistently in every search result. So keep that in mind. I think sometimes, and I know I fall into this as well, when you use schema, you expect it to show up consistently. It's there. Why wouldn't robots use it? But robots have a different way of approaching it and thinking about that. Now, when you are using schema, make sure that you use schema appropriately. Make sure you validate your schema, make sure it checks out. You can use different validation tools to check your schema code and make sure it's properly written. You also want to make sure that you're using schema types that Google and Bing support. They don't support every type of schema that exists out there. They only support specific kinds of schema, and they have their own requirements for what needs to be included in that schema in order to get particular search features. So those are the three behaviors robots go through: crawling, indexing, and ranking. And what we want to really think about as we look at our website is, what problems are we facing? What problems do we really have? A lot of times when I start talking to people, they're working really hard on solving a ranking problem. They're working on schema. They're working on core vitals. But when you actually go through the website and look at it, like, oh, wait a minute, robots are actually really struggling to even crawl this website, or they're struggling to index this website. And you want to make sure you're working at the right level to make sure that you're helping robots where they really need the help. Sometimes robots really do need the help at that ranking level. Other times robots need help with crawling or indexing the website. So you want to make sure you're really approaching each of these areas appropriately. You want help figuring out how to do things with crawling, indexing, or ranking. I have a new book that was published earlier this year by Apress called Tech SEO Guide. Tech SEO Guide provides a reference for everybody working on the technical side of SEO, going through the different terms and concepts and processes that you can go through to find and fix problems that may exist. So if you're curious to check that out, you can learn more about it or find links to purchase a copy at techseoguide.com. Now, I know some of you attending here have purchased a copy already. So if you have, thank you so much for doing so. I really appreciate your support. Also, thank you to those of you who have shared information about the book with other people or posted about it on social media. Really appreciate that as well. So before we wrap up here, I want to cover the future of technical SEO and talk a little bit about this SEO AI revolution that has begun over the last few months. It really started with ChatGPT at the end of last year, but Midjourney was around before that. Google has introduced Bard here just over the last few weeks. Bing has introduced a new AI version of search that's more of a conversational approach to search. That's a totally different way of thinking about things. A lot of other AI tools out there. There's a lot of other things that Google is talking about doing with AI as well. It seems like AI is everywhere these days. It seems like everybody in the SEO space and marketing space is talking about AI and how it's going to change everything. And it seems like a lot. And it seems really confusing where things are going from here. But I think there's a couple things that are worth keeping in mind as we think about this AI revolution that's starting. First thing to keep in mind is that it's not so much a revolution as it is an evolution of where we've already been. Because those of us in SEO, we've been dealing with AI going back at least a decade. Google in 2015 introduced RankBrain, which was their first AI approach to figuring out how to rank content. And in 2015, there were even some Google engineers who came out and said, we don't even know how RankBrain is actually doing everything, how RankBrain is making decisions, because this was an AI tool figuring things out on its own. So we've been dealing with that for years. This is definitely different with what Google is doing with Bard and how they're going to be changing things from here, but it's different along the same path we've already been headed down within the SEO world. In 2018, Google continued with a bunch of AI stuff by introducing BERT. BERT was a language model. Keep in mind, ChatGPT is also a language model. It's a much more sophisticated language model than BERT was, but it's a language model, just like BERT was in 2018. And when Google introduced that, that was a way that Google could understand content in a way very similar to how humans understand content. And it totally changed how Google was indexing content. In 2021, Google replaced BERT with MUM, which was another way of modeling language and understanding what content was talking about. So through all of this, the thing that you really do need to keep in mind is that bots are still bots. Yes, there are many new tools here. There are many new things to think about, but they're all behaving in very similar ways. And that means that they're all coming back to these same fundamental concepts that we've been talking about here today. Bots have to go through and they have to find everything that exists on the web. That's crawling. That's true of Googlebot. That's true of ChatGPT. It has to find stuff. It has to find information that exists. Once it's found, robots have to make sense of that information. They have to organize things. They have to extract meaning from that. With Google, we call that indexing. With ChatGPT, we call that training. It's the exact same concepts, though. And then after they've gone through and figured out what everything is about and made sense of it, robots have to return that to an end user. Now with ChatGPT or Bing's new AI or Google Bard, that's being returned in a conversational search. It's a very different kind of output display, but it's still ranking. It's still the robot trying to make decisions about what information does it display, what order does it show those things in, how does it present that to the end user. So while some of the specific tactics are going to change and while the interface that we work with might change a little bit here with the AI revolution, bots are still working in the same ways. And so to us, as we look at the future, it seems like now more than ever, it's really important that we pay attention to these technical SEO fundamentals that we've been talking about here today, that we make sure that we have a really solid technical structure in place. So that way robots really know how to crawl and index and rank our websites, no matter what the search interface ends up looking like. And all of that really begins by making sure we understand what robots are doing and what robots are really trying to accomplish on our website. So looking at it here, we've got a few minutes left, and I'd be happy to take any questions that you have or anything that you'd like to talk about, either with stuff we've covered today or with technical SEO more generally. So please feel free to post your questions to chat and be happy to answer any questions that you do have. While you are posting questions to chat, I will just drop one final reminder about my new book published by A-Press earlier this year. You can learn more about it at techseoguide.com.
Thank you, Matthew. And thank you again, everyone who joined us today. We did have a few people send us some questions via email ahead of the webinar. So while anyone who's on ponders their question, if you have one, we'll answer a couple of those. So the first one, Matthew, that we got is our website has a lot of product images that rank in search results. Google doesn't always display the image I want. How can I change the image that is displayed?
There's a few different things you can do. So those images that you see show up in search results, some of them Google will just go through the page itself and just kind of grab the image and extract that on its own and figure out what image seems appropriate given the search. So if you are using images on your page that gets that idea of main content versus supplementary content, make sure that image really does look like it's part of the main content of the page. If it's just a header image or it's just kind of tacked onto the page, Google might say, oh, that's not really part of the page. So you want to make sure it really does seem like it's part of the main content of the page. Particularly with products, you can put image values in schema code. And by putting the images in schema code, that does give Google just another signal that, oh, okay, that's the image that I should grab from this page. So thinking about using schema here could help to make sure you're defining that image correctly.
Another question we got, it seems like Google is crawling our website too much. How do we know if they're crawling too much, and when does it actually become a problem?
In general, it's okay for Google to crawl as much as Google wants to crawl your website, at least from Google's standpoint. And it gets to that idea I was talking about earlier of Google's robots are greedy, right? They're going out, they're looking for everything out on the web. They're trying to find everything that exists. So robots are naturally going to crawl as much as they think they need to, given the amount of content that exists on your website. If you're starting to notice that Google is crawling your website in a way that's harming your server, right? They're overloading your server. They're causing your server to crash because they're crawling just too much. Then you do need to take some proactive steps to prevent Google from crawling. There's some things you can do from an emergency crawl reduction level by implementing what are called 429 status codes, and that's where you're basically telling Google, "Hey, calm down. Crawl less." And you can give those signals to Google, and that will tell Google to kind of change their crawl volume. You can also look through what Google is crawling. And if you see Google is crawling files that they shouldn't be crawling, then you can block those files from getting crawled. You want to be careful with that. Make sure that they really don't need to crawl those files. But you can add in some of those blocks on your robots.txt file to make sure that Google is crawling only the appropriate things on your site.
We have Patty and Josh submitted a couple questions. So Patty asks, for WordPress, do you have a recommendation as to the best SEO plugin?
There are a couple of good plugins out there. Yoast SEO's plugin is probably the de facto one that everybody goes to. It's pretty good. Yoast SEO's plugin does like to do some additional things and add some additional features for you. So sometimes you have to go through and turn things off in Yoast SEO and just disable certain things, but it does give you a greater level of control over adding in things like schema types or controlling the XML sitemap. It also gives you places to add in title tags and description tags, set canonical tags, set robot controls on individual pages. It's probably the best one. All-in-one SEO is still considered, I think, one of the better ones out there as well, though it's not as common to see sites working with that one.
Perfect. And Josh asks, can you give us a sense of the state of the industry, meaning how many devs are actually doing it right?
Nice, easy question there, Josh. Thanks. So I think that's been something that has changed over the last handful of years, where I think more developers, more engineers are starting to realize that this is something they need to pay attention to. I think though, when talking with developers, engineers, they give Google and Bing a little too much credit for what they're capable of doing. And they assume that Google and Bing will be able to figure more things out than they're really capable of being able to figure out. JavaScript being a good example. What I was saying earlier about JavaScript events only being triggered on load, that's the only thing Google can load. They can't load click events. A lot of people are surprised by that, where they look at and go, well, how can Google not do that? It's 2023. Come on. Google should have figured out how to click on a button or scroll down a page by now and trigger these events. So they do give it a little bit more credit. But I do think that developers and engineers are starting to thankfully pay more attention to technical SEO, realize that that's really something that needs to be focused on and included as part of redesign, redevelopment projects.
Well, with that, again, thank you everyone so much for joining us today. If you have any other questions or would like to connect with Matthew or I, again, you can visit us at elementive.com. We're here to help. So thank you again for attending, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.